brought up, you have many, many videos. And yet, really, we don't see a great deal of action. The interruption of the oppression, that part would already be, not to be numbed by the videos, but to actually have those videos affect us the way the Minister Cutler talked about last night. We have to work against indifference. As an educator, I'm particularly interested in the ways I can introduce these technologies in the classroom for each student, student by student, to address that indifference. So I'm trying to, if you like, raise their imagination as to what is possible when we think about the prevention lens and the mass atrocities prevention lens. I want them to themselves imagine what is possible through the use of these technologies. They are not a substitute, these technologies, for the reading that we get from history textbooks or from the different methods that we learn about through more traditional pedagogical techniques. They are a complement, and I must emphasize that. They are a complement. But I believe in this time and place, they are a necessary complement to the more traditional learning that we have about different cases, whether it's the Rohingya, whether it's the, in Burundi or in Darfur, the different groups that are vulnerable and are at risk. So the technologies should highlight for us the vulnerability and challenge us to imagine what is possible to create a prevention lens. Now, Eyes on Darfur was the first design and an initial test case. The access to other areas, Zimbabwe, Lebanon, Burma, Somalia, and Sri Lanka, were further evidence of the ways in which this particular design could be applied, and I just left just one image there from Burma. Now, with remote sensing platforms, we've talked a considerable amount about breaking a conspiracy of silence, acknowledging the elephant in the room, the denial that takes place. What I'm suggesting that this particular project in remote sensing can do is to interrupt the time span or to close the window of opportunity in which governments may act with impunity. I think it's very, very difficult to stop a leader who is intent on murdering his or her own people. I think what these technologies over time will do is increasingly give leaders pause in what they do. So when I say to interrupt the time span or to close the window of opportunity, I say to make it increasingly difficult for a leader in a particular space to act with impunity against his or her own people. We also must think about shrinking the space in which unaccountable actions occur as another way of sustaining justice. And then planning with a purpose to lend watchdogs the capacity to perform information collection and dissemination of verifiable data, and that's key, the verifiable data. There, I think that remote sensing platforms are of use when they're combined, when it's possible, with those acting in the field and with those mapping, so in other words, using mapping platforms, who might be located in different parts of the world. You combine the field workers with the imagery analysis with those mapping from different areas in a particular case. Now, Darfur was very difficult in the sense that the access was very hard. Remote sensing is particularly relevant where the access is impossible, but it's also relevant, I think, in combination with other tools where field workers have access, where mapping is used, where local community leaders are engaged. So I think we have to think about remote sensing and geospatial analysis in both contexts, where the access is impossible as well as where it is possible. We also have to look ahead, I believe, to the reach, even in remote areas, on an unprecedented scale of the uses of mobile technologies and the way in which mobile technologies are being mobilized for prevention. And here I think that offers one of the greater possibilities in developing areas, especially where computer infrastructure is weak or non-existent. In many of these areas, quite frankly, there is no computer infrastructure or access, but there is more mobile technology to be attentive to. We also have to be attentive in academic as well as policy communities to problems of data centralization, and this is critical, to questions of whether archived materials provide open or closed data. In some cases, all right, maps and data are public, but the underlying, shall we say, data and access is not public. And what I've included here for you is a graphic and a study, The Politics of Twitter Data, by two colleagues, Pushman and Burgess, who argued that the owners of social media data are the platform providers, not the end users. Our challenge as end users is to make sure that the data that we are able to access is verifiable and that indeed the centralization mechanisms are addressed, and that is a considerable challenge looking ahead. Now, from Eyes on Darfur, I wanted to turn a little bit to one of the platforms, and Naomi is absolutely right, it's by no means the only one, but it is a platform which became very, very prominent in the context of 7/8 election violence in Kenya, and that, of course, is Ushahidi. In Swahili, the definition there, testimony, witness, this was really developed literally within days of the election violence in 2007-2008 by a small group in Kenya to track reports of violence following the elections. This really introduced, as a platform, citizen journalism. And the ability of those on the ground using their cell phones, using SMS, texting, imagery, to upload images and text to a platform, to the Ushahidi platform, for mapping purposes. Now, the platform really has its origins in a collaboration, and that collaboration was with Kenyans, citizen journalists on the ground. The original website was very, very quickly adapted, and that is one of the advantages of Ushahidi as it evolved. It's been used in many, many different contexts. It's an extremely adaptable platform. I used it myself when I engaged on the Libya crisis map, which I'll turn to next. And during that Libya engagement, which was an engagement of several months, the platform must have been adapted 3 or 4 times as the engagement was going on. And that's the type of platform that I think is very, very relevant when we're working in conflict zones, because you have to adapt the platform according to the needs as they're reported in from the ground. Now, the initial website, just to give you a sense, had 45,000 users in the country when the violence occurred. Again, this is 2007-2008. The realization emerged of the need for a platform which could be used by others literally around the globe. And the thing about Ushahidi, quite frankly, is the adaptability and the user access. We used it on the Libya crisis map. There were a number of teams. I was on the verification team, just to give you a sense. The verification team, which was responsible to categorize, research, verify, assess all types of reports coming in from Twitter, from different social media. The bottom line is that I was mapping from New York. The members of my team were also mapping from Asia, from Europe, from Africa, from Latin America. We were literally mapping 24/7 from all points around the globe. And the coordination took place in a Skype chat, and it was fairly tight, meaning that we would map in segments of 2 to 3 hours at a time. When I would stop, another person would pick up, and basically we had the team organized through the Skype chat 24/7 as the reports were coming in. There were thousands and thousands of reports coming in over that series of 3 or 4 months. Therefore, the teamwork had to be extremely tight and extremely coordinated. All of the coordination was done through a Skype chat area that was specifically designed to work on the platform. Now, essentially, Ushahidi as a platform is used all over the world. I will add this caveat. Even though its use has grown dramatically over time, what we face now is the challenge many of you may know as big data. Ushahidi as a platform, all right, encounters difficulties when it has to take in larger and larger volume of data. And big data, as we crowdsource more and more, is going to be a huge challenge in terms of the design of these particular platforms, particularly when we think about mass atrocities prevention. I submit to you, Ushahidi as a platform is not the ideal platform, really, when you're talking about large volumes of data. The most recent elections in Kenya, okay, that just took place, the volume of data coming in from that election through social media, from the ground and the like, was much greater. Therefore, my understanding was that Ushahidi and the Uchaguzi deployment face certain limitations. And I think those limitations have to be addressed as we think about the platforms that we use. And Naomi, I think you realize that there are many different platforms available in Kenya. I think as we assess those platforms, we have to be sensitive to this. Now, I just want to give you, very briefly, an example of what a graduate student of mine did, working from the data that was culled from the Ushahidi platform in 2007-2008 to analyze the Kenyan elections as a case study. What he did was he culled that data, taking a look at all of the text messages, the data that came in from the Ushahidi platform, and he plugged it into a database technology application known as DevInfo. DevInfo allows for data visualization. So essentially what he was doing was, he was working with the data, plugging it in to break down incidences as they were reported by type from the Kenyan elections. So essentially you see there the map, you see the reported incidences, you see the different categories in which they were chronicled. This was done over time. Again, a different type of methodology that we included with the use of this particular technology to help in the research and in the understanding of the violence around the Kenyan elections, to situate it as a particular case study, historically as well as geographically and contextually. So here we have December 2007, different areas, again with the breakdown. January 2008, different charts, different areas, different breakdown according to incident type from report. Working all the way through February 2008, March, April, May. Total incidents in the aggregate by type. Total number of reported riots. So in other words, really drilling down to get as precise, as fine an understanding of what was happening during the elections, particularly as this related to the incidents reported and the violence. Now, that type of technology, the DevInfo technology, which allows for data visualization, is open data, so in that sense, it's accessible. The software is customizable. It's available through national statistical offices, civil society and governments, all others have access to it. It's royalty-free. And you can download it onto any computer, and indeed, now we're also working with mobile access. The challenges of it are the compatibility challenges. So the data compatibility with different systems requires a certain manipulation or a certain harmonization. And then, essentially, we have to think about, in terms of mapping, what is the level we're mapping at? Are we mapping at the local level? Are we mapping at the regional level? Are we mapping at the national level? And how do you apply that technology according to the level at which you are mapping? But it's still a very powerful tool in and of its own right. So, the challenges of mapping elections, and if we just look at the Kenya case study, first and foremost, it's to learn from the data that we cull, that we cultivate, how we can assess documented evidence, and in a sense, how we organize the different messages of the data that comes in as we think about the construction of narratives and stories from the ground up. And this is different from what I think is presented as state narrative. I think what these technologies offer us the possibility to do is think about narratives and stories from the ground, where the local village or the local community context, communal context, is essential in teaching us about what decisions are being made and the ways in which these narratives are created from the experiences at the grassroots. And I think what technologies for prevention and mobilizing technology for prevention offers us is the ability to learn in a balanced way from the stories from the ground. And in that respect, I think it's a complement to what Alan was talking about from the journalistic perspective. When he's working at it from a media perspective, I'm trying to work at this from more of an educational perspective. But those who are being educated in the classes that we teach have aspirations to work in NGOs, have aspirations to work in the field. Therefore, the more that they can learn about the stories from the ground, the more informed they are, the more engaged they are, the more that they can contribute. So in a sense, the mapping is very, very much not only about citizen activism in a crowdsourced generation, it's not only about breaking conspiracies of silence, but it's also about how we link the local to the global, and how we think about the gap that exists between what is termed in the literature I assigned you, the civil society and the predatory society. And those are two terms that I think we need to be very, very aware of as we think about mobilizing technologies for prevention. Because in the civil society, there is the element of accountability. In the predatory society, that is marked by impunity. And essentially, we have to look at these two very, very different notions of the society and assess how we can insert the technologies in such a way that we enhance prevention, but we also think about and imagine ways of sustaining justice. And here, Paulo Freire, I think, is particularly relevant as well, in the emphasis on calls for action around peace and justice issues, with attention to conceptions based on in-depth knowledge and investigation of local realities. So it's not only learning about the stories, it's about imagining how we can, in our own learning, use those stories to inspire us in thinking about prevention. Now, this is an example of the use of Ushahidi on a crisis map, and this was the Libya engagement, which is actually an engagement that was requested by OCHA, by the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Action. And this was really requested by OCHA as a complement to those working in the field in Libya to address what was defined as the shrinking humanitarian space. The shrinking humanitarian space. So mappers were called to assist on the Libya crisis map to evaluate reports coming from the field, from all sorts of social media. And they did this as members of what is known as the Standby Task Force. Okay? The Standby Task Force is a community of crisis mappers that exists all over the world. This is an example of the Libya crisis map, again, working off of the Ushahidi platform that was adapted for Libya. Who participates? It was a global engagement. I mean, we had pretty much volunteers from all continents. Essentially, reports came in on an hourly basis, documenting and detailing those who were subjects of human rights abuses, either fatalities, casualties. It came in the context of, again, very broad data. And what I did was I broke it down in terms of time frame. So by March 6th, we had a certain number of reports coming in to the platform that had to be verified and then posted. And essentially, the verification team handled the majority of the reports in cooperation with the analysis team, and we also had a translation team that was very active working with us. So, in a sense, you see in the graphs, reports of the incidences by category, and reports of the incidences by source. Overwhelming number were coming at us from Twitter. Therefore, the verification was very, very critical. Usually, to verify a report coming from Twitter, those of us on the team were looking for at least 3 or 4 other sources in the regular media that would help us to verify the report coming in from the ground. Once we had 3 or 4 sources, we would verify the report and it would be passed on to the map and then inserted in for the analysis team. Now, in a sense, I think OCHA, in evaluating or assessing the work on the Libya crisis map, talked a great deal about how we as mapping volunteers were be able to, shall we say, establish an unprecedented type of cooperation with those in the field and with those in the office of the UN. And I think that the interesting thing to learn about the Libya crisis map was first and foremost that it was an engagement that was undertaken by specific request, but it was an engagement that probably would not be repeated today, meaning that crisis mappers today are much more reluctant to engage in areas of direct conflict. And the reasons for this are ethical. When you map, there are ethical questions around how you are exposing those in the field and how you are exposing those on the map to targeting. And essentially, I think the leaders in the crisis mapping community are turning to the use of mapping much more to address humanitarian disaster situations, earthquakes, tsunamis, different types of contexts, less that are conflict-driven and more that are strict humanitarian response. Haiti would be a classic example. When the earthquake hit there, there was a great deal of community asset mapping that went on and is still going on in that particular country. So while Libya was a first and very important exercise, it most likely would not be repeated if it was requested today, specifically because the ethics concerns, the targeting concerns of the leaders in the crisis mapping community are such that they really are reevaluating how we map and in what contexts we map. These were the different teams on the Libyan crisis map. We had media monitoring, verification, report creation, analysis, and of course translation. And essentially what I did was I provided a series of resources for you to access that could tell you a little bit more about the Standby Task Force, about the mapping community, about the ways in which it engages in different contexts. And these are just basically maps to show where people work in their engagement. And as you can see, it was pretty much around the globe. The focus was very, very much and still is on societal security when we think about the use of these technologies, mapping, remote sensing. Moving away somewhat from a state-centric view to different reference points. And in a sense, I think that this ties in with the whole emphasis on the grassroots narratives, the emphasis on the local community leader engagement. So the idea that mapping and the uses of these different technologies to mobilize for prevention is very, very much geared towards the ways we interact with groups in society. The obstacles to consider: size of a particular area, particularly when we're talking about a platform like Ushahidi, can it deploy effectively in that area? Lack of infrastructure, so limited electricity or access to technology. Learning from different experiences. A number of NGOs are looking to crisis map in very specific areas where sexual violence, for example, election intimidation is taking place. So how we learn from what we've already done and apply that to what we may plan to do. The ability of governments to shut down an SMS network, which is vital when we think about the need for text messaging. Asking in which instances citizen activists can be instrumental, sorting through and reporting on the data that comes in any mapping engagement, which is quite large. And in some instances, particularly with election monitoring, mapping doesn't work if there are too many reports coming in at once. In other words, if there's infrastructure overload. Now, when we think about mapping and the use of these different platforms, I've already mentioned the concerns about those mapping becoming targets of a repressive government, the uses of the mapping to locate those who are involved in either monitoring. And there are limits, clearly, in terms of who can connect and who can be included. And most remote areas in particular, there's a concern around just how relevant this type of technology can be. Presently, looking ahead, I mean, we see an evolution in terms of the percentage of the global population that will have access, but at present, you know, the numbers in terms of who's actually engaged is still quite a cause for concern. And then the lack of understanding about a local context can cause any project with the use of technology to fail. So that's why we're always looking to assess what we can learn from these different projects, also from the communities locally who are engaged with us and who are trained with us in the uses of the technologies. Now, this is a project that is live, Eyes on Syria, which is currently being, shall we say, implemented by Amnesty International, the Science for Human Rights program. And in a sense, what we're doing as we access Eyes on Syria is to assess the design in terms of costs of inaction, the imperative for what is called in Mobilizing the Will to Intervene, the preventive and proactive policy decisions that we need and to think about when we want to mobilize governments. And Eyes on Syria, I mean, is a design that we're looking at in part because we want to try to assess the ways in which, first, the technology has evolved from the initial Eyes on Darfur project. We want to also assess the challenges that still exist in the sense that these types of technologies do provide the images that we can access to learn more about what's happening on the ground. But what is actually imaged is more destroyed areas. So in other words, you can't really use this technology to help those who are victims of torture or of abuse. What you can do is you can image areas that have been destroyed. You can image areas to show over time what a government might be doing to perpetrate against its own people, but you can't really use it, shall we say, to help victims of abuse. So it's a technology that has certain limitations, but I think it's an important technology to assess nonetheless. And then what I did was, in looking at Eyes on Syria, I went to the literature, and particularly a piece by Joyce Apsel on the history and the challenges and new directions pedagogically in thinking about mobilizing technologies for prevention. And Joyce, who's a colleague of mine at New York University, talks about a number of ways in the classroom that you can introduce in the study of genocide, a number of reflective, shall we say, points. So critiquing a syllabus that you've created, what materials have you included, what materials have you excluded, including media resources. When I include these different technologies in my syllabus, I want the students to reflect on them, but I also want them to think about these tools in ways that are methodologically more sophisticated. So for example, when they try to examine their own prejudices and their own viewpoints, when they think about genocides that have been denied, I want them to reference these particular technologies in their thinking more broadly. As we incorporate different scholarly works that are more recent, I want us to look at those works as we reference different platforms. And then there's one tool, certainly others, but this one tool, eCam, which is a stagpole recorder over the map, which allows students to conduct interviews that are recorded with colleagues in the field. This is yet another way in which they can think about using technologies to formulate research questions, to triangulate their data, to archive bibliographic materials as they prepare to write graduate theses, as they prepare for their own work in the field. And the choices of the text, the choices of the platforms are made according to constructivist principles in pedagogy. So generative learning, for example. Students create the knowledge, but they take responsibility for what they are learning. They anchor their instruction, they relate it in terms of the academic content and literature to their own professional engagement. They cooperate in teams, they accept group projects, like mapping projects, to tackle global concerns. This is yet another way, Frank, I would think, again, working from the classroom out, that we can start to imagine global public squares. So in other words, my students would be interacting, for example, you archived on YouTube your particular Google Plus Hangout. I want to take a look at that, and I want to integrate it into my technology tools, talk about the dialogue that you're starting, and to enhance it. Live public maps, developed with either Ushahidi or other platforms, can help us in Patrick Meyer's thinking to synchronize a shared awareness. And this is an important catalyzing factor if we think about the way in which we develop movements over time, as Habermas discusses in his own literature. Those who take on the tools of an open expression become a public, and the presence of a synchronized public increasingly constrains undemocratic rulers while expanding the right of that public. Now, I think about this in the century ahead, even projecting 10 years, because that's a long time if you think about the development of technologies. There are going to be ways that we can engage virtually that are going to tap into what we already do traditionally. And I think the challenge for us to imagine is the ways in which the engagement in the virtual space can sustain the more traditional face-to-face meetings. So if we engage virtually, and I think my colleagues who are going to present on Syria are going to underline the need for the virtual engagement. As we engage virtually, it should be with the knowledge and with the awareness that the dialogue that we're creating should very much sustain face-to-face meetings and interactions. So we shouldn't divorce what we do virtually from what we're doing in the face-to-face. If anything, we should try to link them closer and closer together. And I think that's one of the challenges that I think about a lot when I try to assess the ways in which these different technologies can be relevant. It's particularly important when we think about the challenge of big data, the responsibility we have on the verification side. One of the concerns with the most recent Kenya deployment is that the data that was collected from the most recent election is so large and still so messy that really there isn't a lot that we can do with it in terms of using it for research, in terms of using it for policy advocacy. And I think that's something that we have to be particularly concerned about. The data that we're collecting and how we use that data, looking ahead case by case to the different ways that we apply these technologies. And then I just use some materials and sources at the close. So I think I will pause there and open it up for questions or discussion. Thank you. Please.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. It's very insightful. I think one of the most important points that you made was that we need to be cognizant of that fine line between what you call the civil society and the predatory society. You mentioned big data, and you referred to Manuel Castells, and I would counter with Big Brother and Michel Foucault.
Absolutely. Well, that's the other. Actually, Foucault is the other side of the spectrum that I use. Yeah.
To what extent can we say that this new technology is the ultimate phenomenon? Big Brother run amok. And I think it's a little bit ironic that you would refer to Habermas, because it seems to me that him and others of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory would be very critical of this relentless kind of scientific instrumental rationality in our emerging surveillance state, this police state.
Yes, I agree 100% with that, although, again, what I'm trying to evaluate in the selection of each of these platforms and different tools and the way in which we apply them. First and foremost, I see those tools depending on how they're applied. And again, the technologies are neutral. It's what we do with it that makes the difference.
And we need to recognize that these emerging technologies exist in a world defined by social relations of power.
Clear. That's absolutely clear. But the capacity to reach deep and to drill down and to have access to local narratives, I believe, is still there.
Yeah, I agree. That's what I like about this idea, and you emphasize it, I think you get to use it this much, but it's focused on this bottom-up
No, it is, because if it's top down, then I agree with you that it's Foucault and that you really are talking about something that really is so overtly centralized
Sure.
that the relevance of it beyond that is just not recognizable. But if you're working from the bottom up, then I think the challenge is how you apply more traditional methodologies to the use of the tools. Because the tools in and of themselves are not enough. We have to be thinking about making them relevant, first from the ground up, but also having them as a complement to the traditional methods that we use.
Well, I don't think we can overemphasize it. This data collection, we need to recognize its potential for these, and as much as said, as much as really, I wanted to kind of move forward on the point you made and underscore, as you put that bottom line between the protecting civil society, but at the same time risking the denial of those very liberties that we celebrate in our,
You mean in the ways in which data can be manipulated?
Right, sure. I'm thinking of, the fundamentals of the right to privacy. That, every action you make, every move you make, scrutinized.
And surveyed, yeah.
Surveilled.
Well, no, that is the ethical concern. No, it is the ethical concern, as I said. It's manifested itself in the mapping community early on. Because, the mapping community has stepped back considerably from engaging, first from engaging in conflict areas, but also in terms of thinking about how the mapping can be a tool mobilizing for prevention. And this is something which keeps them up at night, quite frankly, for the reasons that you raised. And I'm not really sure if they're going to address it, because I think that they think right now there's not a great deal that can be done. Yeah, Frank.
So sorry, people are telling me back, they can't hear.
Oh, sure. Sorry.
So please, if you have a question, please get up and move.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, we should have continued that. Yeah, absolutely. Please, Frank.
Yeah, I'd like to offer a kind of historical comment on the last exchange briefly. From the point of view of the victim in the crosshairs of people trying to murder the members of their group, the discussion about the very interesting and important perspectives that were just discussed is irrelevant. It is from our point of view, because here we are at liberty to do all kinds of things, and we don't want to be surveilled constantly, and they don't want to either. But actually, the opposite is the case when they're in the crosshairs of the site. They want to be surveilled. The ANUAC called on us from Ethiopia, border with Sudan, when they were being murdered, and it was only through the deployment through a satellite that the U.S. had access to that verification of the murder of 200 of them was confirmed and then acted on and stopped. The Jews of Hungary wanted very much to be on the radar screen of the Allies, and they were pushed off that radar screen, and that facilitated their destruction because no warnings were given by BBC Hungarian service in 1944. And so I think we can integrate all of this and take it aboard, but when we do so, let's be very careful to remember the victim's perspective. This technology, let me put it this way. The perpetrators take our technology and use it better than we use it, normally, right? As they did with radio in Rwanda. Our job is to ensure that we reverse the situation and stay ahead of it. And that includes surveillance. But their real issue for the foreseeable future is not that their civil liberties are being curtailed by surveillance of the type Operation PRISM institutes, but rather that data is not used because nobody wants to intervene, and therefore they don't reveal what they have.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
No point taken, no. No point taken.
Thank you, Colette, for quite an interesting presentation.
Please.
Just a couple of things in terms of security issues, you know, unintended consequences, trying to do no harm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did Amnesty do any analysis as to whether picking those 12 villages possibly led to unintended consequences elsewhere?
Mm-hmm.
Because the government, you know, as soon as a website goes live, the government's going to be reading it as well.
Right.
And it just, was there any analysis done as to whether...
In the literature that I read evaluating that project, I didn't come across that, although I believe, given the concerns around that as an initial project design, there was most likely a follow-up. Because, you know, the idea of Eyes on Darfur was to situate that project initially in terms of what they could learn to then apply it more broadly. So I would be very surprised if that wasn't considered, because it's a fairly important, piece to assess as you're thinking about why you selected these specific places and what the implications of that selection are.
And secondly, having done election monitoring in Sri Lanka on seven different occasions, from 94 to 2010, stories go around, and often they're deliberately out there to misinform and send you to places that they want you to go to because they're going to do crap elsewhere, to be blunt. What, the Ushahidi, how did they mitigate against that unintended consequence?
Well, I know that in the latter deployment, so the one, the Uchaguzi that just happened in 2013, that was really run, in my understanding, Dowdy, where, Naomi, you would know this, that was very, very much driven by the local engagement, and I think that they organized themselves quite well, as Naomi referenced as well, so that deployment was very, very much run with a great deal of local community, shall we say, focus and awareness. Those of us on the map who were actually assisting from different parts of the world were relying very, very much on the local engagement.
What's your awareness as the monitors on the ground? How much were they interacting real time with? My experience of it was that platform was redesigned to enhance the ability to interact from the ground up. So that it was tighter, certainly, than it was in 7-8. They learned a lot from the initial experience. If I understood correctly, you had people trying to monitor incidents and people actually trying to monitor the election at polling stations. And obviously there would be a convergence on occasion.
Yeah.
So there were.
I believe there was. Naomi, you were present during or.
To be very, very frank and on the record, the reality is at the hub, it was really quiet because the election, for the most part, barring irregularities in voting, was quite safe.
Yeah.
And they had monitoring on lots of different levels, monitoring of the media, monitoring of polling stations, but that was run by another organization that kind of fed in, and then monitoring of violence, which, as you said, was through this kind of very, very broad.
But there was information exchange and synergies were attempted
in the hub.
Yeah, okay.
As an attempt to. But one of the things that I think you raised, it's actually the amount of money that they had for the project around Kenya only was sufficient to allow them to exist for a couple of days.
Right.
And it's worth just highlighting that there were multiple platforms were funded by different donors. And one of the biggest challenges in Kenya is even if there had been violence, which thankfully there wasn't on a large scale, one of the greatest challenges, and I think you can highlight it too, is you can have the early warning, which will be beneficial for all of us, and it's not even early warning, it's attesting to crimes are happening. But in a country where there is the absence of the ability for security forces to be able to act on that, or where security forces are actually perpetrating the crimes, what is the benefit then sometimes of the mapping? it's useful after the fact for those of us who are going to work for accountability or mobilize action, but in terms of saving lives in the moment, if the police officer in Kisumu is motivated by ethnic identities and different issues, are they going to respond to it? And that's not to say there's not value, I'm just highlighting some of the challenges that exist.
No, absolutely.
Just I wanted to finish. I was in London during the riots, and a couple of friends and I spent an evening just observing Twitter reports about the riots. And the disinformation that was out there, just for something like that,
No, it's very real.
It was amazing.
It's very real.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why I say the challenges of verification are significant. I mean, I think that it was very instructive to look at 2007, 2008, and 2013. I don't think that you can draw causal inferences and say, that there was less violence in 2013 because of mapping, but I think what you can say is that the attention was so focused in a very concentrated way on the deployment that, in a sense, those of us who were very interested really kept our, shall we say, level of engagement fairly high. And I think that is important as a testimony to the ways in which these technologies can continue to be used. But Kenya was also an exceptional case. I mean, mobile penetration is high there. Kenya's that's admittedly a very exceptional case in that regard. Yeah.
It used to be exceptional.
It's changing over time. Yeah.
I'll ask questions.
Claudia, you might know of it, but there was an interesting project done at Harvard at the Carter School for Ignorance. I know it's wrong, but at the Kennedy School.
Right.
Called the Marrow Project, the Mass Atrocity Response Operation.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a really interesting concept in that called the power witness, saying how old technology, but new technologies can be used to capture evidence of atrocities and be used to actually stop the actors from carrying further atrocities or be used for further prosecution. And I'm wondering about some of the technologies you applied. Are they being used for that to actually be shared, with the ICC or any groups that can eventually lead to prosecution, either domestically or internationally?
My colleague Susan Wolfenbarger at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, this is the project that she's working on now, Kyle. And I think that she's very, she started working at it more in a domestic context, but now they really want to broaden it out to cases internationally. And I think that the focus is very much how do you design, how do you apply these maps so that you can actually produce evidence that would be submitted. Now, I believe in certain cases they did have a fair amount of success, and I can go back and look through the literature, but I think that certain evidence produced by AAAS was submitted to the court. And I think that that's an area that we really have to, because it's controversial in the sense that how much of this evidence can you really submit? And I mean, I think that's the question. But I think that as they learn more and more from each design, each project design, they're working in, shall we say, ways of making sure that what is gathered, what is tracked, is submittable. And I think that that's really the path that they're on. But I could talk with Susan about it and send you the information, because I know some evidence was submitted.
It's more of a comment. You didn't talk about it, but I found it quite interesting. Anonymous, known to hack into people's accounts for all sorts of reasons, about, I think, a year ago, was able to hack into Assad's personal account and actually publish through WikiLeaks an entire series of emails of the Assad family, and they were going shopping and what the plans. But I'm wondering if that could also be a way to find technology to actually expose the internal communications of some of these authorities to actually put that in the public domain.
No, absolutely, and I mean, I think as, shall we say, people become more sophisticated in what they're able to access, certainly that's a way of interrupting, if you like, what's going on. Yeah. A very, very creative way, in fact. Yeah. Okay. trying to think how we could promote this further. Let's go back to the case of the Rohingyas, if I might, for a moment. You mentioned that you had a lot of video evidence. Could you share a little bit? I mean, what exactly do you have, and how was that acquired?
Yes, I do. Those videos mostly are from the central Burma, not from the Arakan state. Unfortunately, Arakan state is the least developed part of the country. Also, especially the Rohingya area, people were not allowed to carry cell phones and digital cameras and all sorts of little small technology. They were fined, they were sent to jail if somebody carry those things. But in the capital city of the Arakan, or Rakhine state, some people had this cell phones they used to capture some of the burning, beating, killings and stuff like that. Those videos later became available through internet. And what we did was, as soon as it is there, we saved it. And then next day it is not there actually. Somehow either it was hacked or removed from the YouTube. Also similar videos from the central Burmas are available, a lot of them, while they were chopping off their heads and these burning bodies, burning people running around with fire. And police in groups standing and doing nothing really while those mobs came in and destroying things. And even police were aiding them. Those videos, a lot of them are.
See, I mean,
also, I actually have a question. For example, how can we assist or how can we get data from the areas that were like Arakan, Rakhine State, where Rohingyas were killed, or a lot of destruction has been done, and where ordinary people don't have these tools to capture anything.
Right. No, I mean, I think this is the issue, and it's as much an infrastructure issue as it is, I guess you could say, a selection issue, because I think as we apply the tools more broadly, I mean, it becomes a question of how do you link into the local groups that might be effective in orienting the work that we do. And, I mean, clearly in the more repressive states, I mean, the challenges are first and foremost, I mean, how you would even begin to think about accessing groups and how you even begin to think about working with local community leaders. And this is where I think that we certainly learn from each case, where we either map or we design a particular platform. But there are always going to be those cases where we have to refocus our attention because the challenges to access are so great. That's all the more reason why we should make the effort. But I mean, there's a lot of, shall we say, work to be done in those areas. And that's where we rely very, very much on the knowledge of those who know the context from the ground up, historically, contextually, geographically. And I mean, that's where the work remains to be done, very much so.
Yeah, I also realized that this, at the beginning, this government and the Buddhist community, they kind of showed a lot of videos saying that this violence was started by Muslims. What happened was these monks and Buddhists, they can have any tools they would like to have, they can afford to have. But the Muslims are prevented from carrying cell phones or any digital cameras or anything like that. So when things started at the border town with Bangladesh, some people reacted, these kids, and they threw stone and stuff in big group. And those months they captured these videos and quickly disseminated to their community. Plus, they used the government media like television and newspapers, all those, to show how these so-called Bengalis or Bangladeshi intruders coming to take away Burma or occupy Burma. That's the thing they started actually. That's the main focal point they used to justify the killing of these people. And because these Rohingyas did not have anything, they couldn't capture anything actually. Although later, I believe it was Amnesty International had some pictures taken, like satellite pictures published. It was just showing what was before and what was after life, after the burning of areas. But the killing and slaughtering, none of those were captured by the Rohingyas.
So you didn't have, in a sense, what Alan was showing in the video of what happened in Rwanda?
I do, but not at the extent that it took place, or yeah, very minimal. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, again, there are limitations without the active cooperation of local community leaders. There are limitations to what we can actually achieve. The tighter the link to the local community, the more that you can actually achieve from the ground up. And therefore, it's very, very important to be able to establish those communications and those networks fairly early on. The more effectively you can do that, that influences the selection of the tools that you use and how efficient you use them. So it's very, very important in that respect. Yeah, fine.
This is really a very fruitful discussion, and I'm really happy it's taking place. Just a few brief comments to follow up on Anwar's and your points. First of all, Anwar, the barring of cell phones with cameras, cell phones generally, from any part of Burma or in any country today is an early warning sign of looming mass atrocity intent. And that is a critical sign. It's not on our list because it hadn't happened much before, right? But in fact, that's a very telling regulation, all right? That's really important, and that ought to be more widely disseminated. They don't want evidence to get out. Why not? The people I recently met with on Myanmar, who are very much involved in the negotiations and field reporting, etc., are very concerned that what's been happening to the Rohingya is part of a much broader conspiracy to justify another military intervention and to create a state of emergency that will require a new intervention by the military in Myanmar and roll back the progress that's been made from a faction of the military. And barring cell phones, so one can't record who the real aggressors are, effectively is a pretty good strategy from the point of view of people who might want to do that, right? The second thing is something we learned, that we learned in Kyrgyzstan. So some of you know that in June of 2010, there was killing in Osh in southern Kyrgyzstan, where a lot of the people are actually Uzbek in terms of their long-term, 3 centuries back origin, and in Jalalabad province. And what was instrumental in triggering a lot of the violence that was focused and directed and was not spontaneous until what I'm going to tell you next happened, is a video that claimed to show the rape by people of Uzbek origin of a girl who was of Kyrgyz origin was circulated widely and intended to arouse mass hysteria focused against the Uzbeks. And it succeeded. It was not discredited. The government did nothing to stop it. And although they claimed at the time that about 200 people were killed, the accurate number, according to the state security people we met with in Kyrgyzstan, is 2,000. And there were thousands of rapes of mostly Uzbek women as a consequence, in retribution, supposedly, for what had happened. And a lot of people doing these things believed what they had seen on this video. But it was, as in the case you offered us, a total misrepresentation. It was the opposite. And we know as well that in the former Yugoslavia, it was very common for some of the initially Serb broadcast media to misrepresent both the finding of bodies, rapes, and other atrocities as inflicted on Serbs, when in fact it had been inflicted in the reverse direction. So, in fact, the more cell phones you have, the more you can record, the better off you are. The triangulation can only be accomplished if you have a variety of perspectives. And finally, our biggest problem in dealing with hate propaganda in 2007 in Kenya was the failure to record the hate broadcasts in the vernacular languages of Kenya that were used in the call-in radio shows that whipped up the killing in the Rift Valley. And we have lost the capacity, and it's so ironic, actually. It's so ironic. You know, in the Cold War, everything was monitored that could be monitored using the technology of the time, right? So you had, under the CIA, but public, the Foreign Broadcast Information Service of the U.S. government. You had the BBC monitoring service, and their capacity to translate from hundreds of languages to English for analysis, etc., was enormous. Their budgets today are like 5% of what they were during the Cold War. So when there was a follow-up to the hate media use in Kenya in 2007, it turned out that nobody had a series of tapes of these vernacular broadcasts. So, in fact, for the ICC and others, this is a huge problem. More monitoring rather than less monitoring is what we needed in that case. And I think that we really have to distinguish between the very understandable and I think correct fears of Big Brother in certain societies emerging, and the realities on the ground in places like Kenya, etc. I guess the basic principle is not to make the perfect the enemy of the good. In other words, the risks are certainly there, and I think we're all very wise to note the dangers. But let's get the balance of probabilities right and recognize that while in the future it may turn out to be a huge problem, and we may have 1984 and 2034 or 54, the real problem right now is the opposite on balance. But we can't go forward without awareness of these future dangers.
Well, no, I mean, I think that's absolutely right, Frank. I mean, I think the concern around the data, first and foremost, is how you clean it up. I mean, the curation of it, Frank. The curation of it.
But I don't want to...
No, please.
Somebody else wants to... So how do you do the curation of the data? There are people here who know more about it than me. But one of the keys when you read people like Patrick Meyer and others is triangulation. And what that means basically is with Twitter accounts, as I'm sure you in fact enacted, you try to determine whether the person who's twittering, oh, there are dozens of people being killed here, etc., etc. Did that person have a Twitter account before this started? Did this person show any evidence in the past of being interested in human rights issues? Or is this an account that was just created in order, perhaps, to disseminate false information and misleading information? And I think that we're becoming more sophisticated ourselves, but it takes a lot of labor. In the end, all this, you can triangulate whether they had an account using software, etc. But in the end, we still need the eyes on the page.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
so it will. All right. So you know what I'm saying.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I think that that's one of the issues that came up on the Libya map quite frequently because the overwhelming number of reports were coming off of
So yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's a concern that I think also dovetails with, you know, how you control for data that is increasingly centralized if platforms are controlled and the availability of the data is simply more closed than open. And I think that's what I would be more concerned about at this point in time. Because you have large volumes of data, but how much can you get your hands on and what you need in order to evaluate a situation?
As much as possible.
Yeah, one would absolutely hope, yeah. I would be curious though, I mean, how many of you have actually, oh my God, how many of you have actually worked on platforms as part of either election monitoring or humanitarian assistance? I mean, is this something where you're using technologies in your work? In what way?
Database administration.
I'm sorry?
In database and
Please.
I mean, I've been working in many countries like Rwanda, East Timor, and Kosovo, where we were implementing database. And at that time, we can see the evolution of the telephone, which was a great and very big impact, because of course they don't have the infrastructure, so that was a quick and easy way. But what I was wondering is all those technology you are talking about, it's all how you're going to make the link between the real event, according to the video you're going to see. Because just to make it funny, we can ask how many Bin Laden video was real. I mean, so we can always think that you need to be able to encrypt your data, to transfer it. You need to have it in the language of the people, unless you all bring that through the journalism we saw yesterday, and you can go through this. But I mean, on Skype, yes, you can record and things like that, but I mean, I don't see it from the perspective of computer engineering or something. I don't see it as a proof for, let's say, going to terminal. I think it's good right now for monitoring, but if you want to get proof, I mean, I can send you a picture of I took in Rwanda, but if you ask me, I can go and talk and Amsterdam or somewhere to talk about it and say, yeah, it's really me, I see that for real. That's the link that you need, I think.
Yeah, I mean, our concern, especially on the Libya crisis map, was there was a public map and there was a private map. And the reason for that was there was certain information that we simply did not want to reveal to the public as the conflict was going on. So you had two different maps that essentially were created. One for what was largely OCHA internal use, and then the other which was largely available to the public and the media. And I think there was about a 24-hour time delay between what we were reporting and what was actually happening from the ground. So I mean, again, that as a first experience was important for us to learn about how essentially we would work from the ground up. And I think it was valuable, very much so in that respect. Yeah,
quick question, not really a technical one, but more a financial one.
Please.
I think there's so much interesting work being done in this field, and there's a disconnect between practitioners, academics, and then those who develop technology, so the engineers and the programmers and the nerds and all so forth. But I'm asking this question because, as far as I know, there's only one national government, which is the U.S. through the U.S. Agency for International Development. It's working with Humanity United to actually have this tech challenge, where they're giving money to NGOs, to researchers, to work, to bring people together and develop new technologies. And on that side, MIGS, my institute, is looking to, well, actually, we've already set it up digitally on a Twitter account, looking to actually establish a digital mass atrocity prevention lab. And my question to you, because you work in different boards, there's tech change in Washington, who out there is funding this work? Is it the private sector? Is it an emerging amount of governments, or are there only a small group of foundations?
I think there is a small group of foundations, Kyle, but I think that foundations are also, looking at what's being done and what projects are being proposed, because frankly, it's a very new area. And therefore, I think there's a certain caution in terms of assessing, what are the criteria in terms of how do you evaluate the project, and ultimately how do you insert it. Does it fit into existing programmatic responsibilities, or are there new programmatic responsibilities or lines that have to be created in order to, shall we say, include it? And I think that that's an area looking ahead for the foundation world to be cognizant of what's out there and how it might correspond to where they're thinking about moving their program areas. Particularly for the more established foundations. Now, what I find interesting is you have in New York, you have in London, you have in Nairobi, in Washington, D.C., this technology salon, which meets, I would say, probably now monthly, around very, very different relevant issue areas, and you have a number of foundation representatives that are attending those salons. They're attending them, I think, to learn more about the projects that are being created, the projects that are being designed. Oftentimes the speakers are coming from Africa or other continents where the interest is to be thinking about new technologies and new applications. So what's being created through those salons is a very new circle of networks. My colleague Linda Raftree is very, very engaged in that, and I think that really is a novel way of using the salon to get us to think about how the NGO world, how the foundation world, how the academic world, the governmental world interact, and how new projects can be designed. It's multidisciplinary in the sense that the circles are always cross-cutting. So you're always going to have in those salons at least several representatives from foundations, but then you're also going to have everybody else in the mix. And I think that that's for the good, because that'll help the foundations as they think through what they might want to consider their priorities as they see the new projects being introduced. And the projects introduced from Africa, the most recent one I saw was a tablet that was being introduced, an expensive tablet for schools there, very informative. And I know that there were at least 2 or 3 foundation members in the audience. So, and we had probably, I would say, between 50 and 60 people at that salon. So I mean, they're well attended, and as I say, they're across these different cities, which I think is for the good. They're not necessarily always coordinated, but once a month, you'll have 3 or 4 of them on the different continents. Please.
Thank you very much for your session. I wanted to share a bit with you that within our office, this is an issue that is increasingly raising interest, and our special advisor is very interested in see how we can utilize more these sources of information. With all the challenges, caveats that have been discussed here, and of course they cannot probably be a primary source for accountability, but they can definitely be a support in the monitoring work that is being done and in the assessments. My question, or I wanted to throw a bit of a challenge, because I think this could be a very relevant tool for UN workers out there in the field, for missions, for human rights components. I think these tools would also benefit from the information that those UN deployed out in the field. I would see that very difficult to happen. I mean, having worked on many human rights missions, I think that we would not be allowed to share this type of information. But maybe you could think further on how you could bring the UN more to these types of tools, either for us to use it or for us to also find a way to participate. I think it would be beneficial for both these platforms and also for the work that the UN does.
I mean, it's very interesting because, and you mentioned it in your presentation, the Great Lakes region, for example, has among the most proactive in thinking about early warning and in thinking about different mechanisms. And I think that there are certainly colleagues in the mapping community who have taken a lot of the experience that they've had with the different deployments to date
have seen the challenges, have seen the limitations, and have thought about, well, how could we create, for example, using the technology, something of relevance for the Great Lakes region. And I think if there is ever any region in which your office is engaged, if there is any perhaps way to bring the UN in more closely to this type of work, it would be starting with that particular area. Now, I think that the challenges that you raised both in your presentation and now are very real, in that there are certain limitations on what you can share. There are certainly member state sensitivities, and there is certainly always in this context the imperative of selecting the proper tool for the proper environment, depending on the terrain, depending on the geography and the infrastructure of what you have in mind. But I think that it would do us well to bring together our area specialists, to bring together our technology people with your field officers and with your persons in New York to really be thinking about how projects could be designed. I think it's that interaction, that sharing of information that is essential. If not, I'm afraid that we are too siloed. The technology people focus on what is most interesting for them technologically, certainly that's important, but if it has no relevance with the area in which you wish to design, then it's not helpful. So we need a lot more, shall we say, cross-fertilization of information to avoid the silo effect. Please.
I've spoken 3 times.
Well, Frank, we invite you to speak a 4th and 5th.
You are such a good storyteller. Yes, I have 2 particular questions. Number 1, essentially, it occurs to me, and please forgive me because I'm not, even though I'm from Waterloo, and if you're from Waterloo, then there's an expectation that you may, anyway. Otherwise people look at you like you've got the bubonic plague or something. But the idea is that it seems to me that in terms of the use of the cell phone and so on, there needs to be an intentionality. So someone has to record something, someone has to send the information. But what about things like an open path, sort of an app, right? And where all you do is you have the cell phone on, and it kind of records the data and so on and so forth. Right? So my first question is, could there be an app for that, and which essentially may potentially provide some kind of solution for this, intentionality and the ethical norms. The other question is more on the educational front, and my question is, what was the experience of the students once they completed the projects? Did you have a chance to get them to complete a self-reflection of some sort, and what was their experience?
Absolutely. I mean, we did extensive assessments at midterm. First, we identified students for particular projects, according to their research interests, according to their area interests, according to their functional topic interests. They were assigned to different mapping projects accordingly. Then they were given every opportunity to receive training from standby task force members. They were given opportunities to engage further within the teams. They were encouraged to make use of their linguistic abilities, so to apply their language skills in the particular teams. Their area expertise, because a number of the students were from the areas in question. So every effort was made, and then there were certain students who went back into the field. So I have one Kenyan student who is over there now, who's following up with her work in the spring, in the ethnic conflicts course, with her work in Kenya, in the field. So there was every effort made to match up the student with the particular deployment so that they could maximize linking, again, according to the anchor instruction. We want to link the learning to the professional engagement to make sure there is as tight a fit as possible. And I think the students very much appreciated this because, again, they have all of the traditional opportunities to learn about these different cases, and then some. What this offered was a complement to that, which allowed them to engage in very specific ways, mapping, which allowed them to, shall we say, develop a comparative, a historical understanding of a specific case through the engagement with the particular deployment. And I think that was the differential in the learning. As far as your first suggestion, we need to keep it in mind.
Thanks so much.
Kyle has informed me that you have been such an engaged audience. We have 0 time left, and far be it for me to stand between you and your coffee break. So it remains for me to thank you, and we welcome the next presentation.